Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Dr. Paul.
Good to have you here today, and we want to talk about tariffs, tariff wars, and China in particular, but anything to do with the confusion on our foreign commerce. It's a mess. It's growing, and it seems to be getting worse. And I think it's safe to call it a trade war right now. It's just not the tinkering. And we've done a lot of that for a long time. I think all the countries have done it. And I think back even 30 or 40 years ago, we put protection for our sugar beet farmers. And we've kept sugar out for a long time to prop up the prices of sugar. But this goes on all the time. And there are literally, I think, thousands of little things like that. So it isn't like perfect free trade existed before this trade war, but something happened a year or so ago, and there's been these sanctions, there's been retaliations, there's been disruption in the markets, and it was supposed to be that we've been getting wiped out by China, and therefore we had to do something. And everything we've done so far has seemed to make things worse. And we were due for some serious changes in our economy, and that we are on the verge, if not in the early parts of a recession. And then this trade argument, of course, is just aggravating it. So I think that things aren't as smooth as they pretend to be, because everybody says, the economy looks great. But the markets are saying the economy isn't quite as great as it appears on the surface, and sometimes we hear fictitious numbers. But I think it's a serious thing, because we all have studied and know that countries that can't get along together, and they don't trade and they don't travel, and people don't go back and forth, goods don't go back and forth, it usually ends up in a hot war. And this certainly could be argued was the case in the 1930s, because the Depression started and they wanted to blame somebody else, so they had protectionism, and before you knew it, the situation led to World War II. So this is why it's very, very dangerous. I think it's easy to argue the free market principle. Just don't mess with this stuff at all. The many thousands of little things that we do is really protectionist. But then when you get into trade wars and there's blanket tariffs and then there's retaliation, that's when it gets danger. And Chris, I would say that we're in that danger period right now.
That's right, Dr. Paul. And I just wanted to mention what our friend Jacob Hornberger pointed out recently is, President Trump unilaterally just imposed these tariffs, which are taxes on American consumers. And I hope most people know that by now, that we're the ones that pay these tariffs. And Congress, as has become the tradition, is nowhere to be found. And the president brags openly about how many billions the government is taking out of our own pockets. And it's done very whimsically. He raises tariffs even more, and he says he has some regret that he doesn't raise them even higher. So there's a very, very big disconnect from what Americans are taught that their government is in their government schools or the government media for adults versus what the government actually is and the powers that have accrued in the presidential office.
Right. Excuse me. And you mentioned the important thing about who's really in charge of our trade policy. The Constitution is very clear. Foreign commerce is to be regulated by the Congress. And the clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, was actually put there, for domestic uses, but it was to keep the states from imposing protectionists. They want free trade. But it's Congress's responsibility, and yet look at what a president can do by executive order. Not only can he put on tariffs, even though technically he's probably given that authority by the Congress, but that's transferring constitutional powers to the president that he can do whatever he wants. This is the same thing about sanctions. I think sanctions are so dangerous, and they're acts of war. And yet the president does this all the time, and they're very, very painful to so many countries. And we can use examples when the sanctions go on that it hurts us, but it really hurts the wrong people that we're trying to punish. It's never the governments that get punished. It's usually the innocent children and the civilians that have nothing to do with the wars that we're engaged in or getting ready to get engaged in. So this is something technically, if it had been run the right way, that it had to have a lot more votes on this in the Congress. But the real tragedy is the acceptance of these sanctions as well as tariffs. And there's complaints about it. But a lot of conventional economists, even free market economists, have come over and they have said very little. And yet here we are, we have this raging war, and it's sort of blame somebody else. Of course, right now the blame is placed on China. It's all their fault. But there's the trade imbalances. We buy more stuff from them than they buy from us. But that's a simplistic answer. And to say, oh, we have to even up that trade balance, it doesn't make any sense, because basically it's the American consumer who likes that deal, because they get cheap products, and we have cheap money too, because we get to print the fiat currency. We send that money over to China, we get cheap goods, and then China is willing to finance our deficits by buying our treasury bills. And I think we have a pretty good deal, and yet it's all China's fault. They're selling us more stuff than they buy from us. And of course, buying our debt is a big deal. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation on this idea that we have to blame China for the imbalance of trade. It's a lot more complex than that.
That's right, Dr. Paul. And President Trump, he's making some very un-American statements recently. One saying he's the chosen one to take on China. And then this one was a real kicker, saying our great companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China. And I have to ask the question, what would happen if Hillary Clinton made these statements if she were president? What would the reaction be from the limited government Republicans? Would they be crying socialism or dictatorship? Just because the media has been unfair to President Trump and the Democrats have been off the wall on him does not mean that he should get a pass. If he's going to take your liberty, what difference does it make if it's the Democrats or President Trump? So if you're a Trump supporter, these are not okay statements to make for him to order companies what they should be doing with their own property. So, speak up and don't remain silent just because he's been treated unfairly.
There's a complaint about the intellectual property, and that we charge China with stealing intellectual property, and that is a serious and a complex problem. But there's some of it that is misconstrued as well, because when our companies go over there, they're very anxious to go to China, and a lot of them are over there. But when they go in, they sign up and say that we're going to share in your technology. So it is really, much of that is contractual, and we can't just say everything that they have gained, because our companies benefited by that. And yet it's always, they stole this and they stole that. That goes on, and I'm sure that happens on both sides. But I think that not many people talk about the fact that the agreement of our companies is that we will not try to prevent them from having that, and that will be shared. But this whole issue of precious earth minerals, I think, is interesting, because China sells us 80% of the minerals, the rare earth minerals, which are very important in our national defense. So we're dependent on it. And very rarely China will say, you guys better behave, or we're not going to send you any more of that rare earth. But just think of that. They have our currency that they could help crash the dollar, and they have the rare earths, and we depend on 80% of what we have. And then they just go on. So they have the weapons, and that's why we should be more cautious in what we do, because sometimes what generally happens, even in a hot war, people misconstrue and misunderstand their enemies, and the minor confrontation turns into a major confrontation, and that's what's happening right now in the trade war. It's getting bigger and bigger, so nobody knows what will happen. So if it gets much worse, yes, there could be this time where the rare earth minerals could be denied to us, and that, of course, would just aggravate us to go and do more. But this idea, of course, of what's going on in the South China Sea, it's far from perfection, but that's a long way off for us to be telling China exactly what to do in the South China Sea. To me, that's sort of like China or Russia or somebody coming and telling us what we're going to be doing in their acceptance of everything that they want to do in the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody would care about that. The truth is, in this day and age, building an airstrip in the South China Sea is hardly a threat to the United States. That just seems absurd. If it's a threat to neighboring countries on there, let them deal with it. But this whole idea, I just get nervous when they start sending these vessels and testing it, and we fly the airplanes over, and we do a lot of China bashing, which I think is so unnecessary. But they don't recognize that some of this success of China has been sort of capitalistic. They make stuff, they sell it to us, they make profits, they save it, then they invest, and they invest around the world. They didn't send armies out to get control of these precious earth minerals. They did it by going out and investing money they earned from us. And so for them to just throw out the term, they're a bunch of communists. Yeah, they have their problems, but I'll tell you what, we're not the epitome of a free market economy either. I mean, we have a real special interest economy that's designed to help banks and big business and all the rest in the military-industrial complex. So I just wish there would be more balance. Sometimes a lot of this stuff could be just ignored. The hardest thing for people to understand is, well, what if they're putting sanctions on us? Isn't the only thing left is for us to put sanctions on them? Well, that just makes things worse. It is tough in the interim because it hurts the businesses that want to continue to sell things, but they're hurting their people. They're making them pay if you put on tariffs, and then and keeping our products out. That just hurts the consumer, and I think you already mentioned that. So we should be willing to depend on the free market, and it's not nearly as bad as some people think. People and the consumer. In the free market, the consumer makes these decisions, not labor and not big business or whatever. The consumer buys goods where they want. And I argue this whole thing about free trade, which makes a lot of people nervous, is really a civil liberty, because I don't believe in the income tax. I believe people ought to have an incentive to work. I have a belief that people ought to keep their money and not have to give it to the government through the income tax, and that they have the right to spend the money the way they want. Now, if you're not really in a hot war with somebody, and you have people who have worked hard and saved, and they can get shoes for $25 instead of $100, shouldn't they have the right to spend their money where they want? And besides, it makes you more competitive. There was a time when there was a lot of this going on in the 80s. Our automobiles were much worse, and we were trying to keep out the other automobiles. But what was needed was to have the competition until we improved our automobiles. No, it's a tremendous incentive to improve it when we're not competing. But it's a lot more complicated when it gets involved in currency transactions. When you have the reserve currency of the world, you have tremendous advantage over there, which indirectly messes up the balance of trade. So if you get to print gold and the money of the world and you spend it generously around the world, of course you're going to buy more stuff than they might. But there's always a balance of payments. I mean, they don't take our dollars, China or anybody else, they don't take our dollars and bury them or put them in a shoebox and save them. They immediately invest them in something. And this idea that they won't buy stuff, it means that somebody's pricing them. Somebody's getting a better deal by buying a cheaper product. And it's usually the consumer, because the consumer could back off, and there are times when they do. They look at that, buy American American, I have to admit, sympathetically, if I have a choice, I sort of like the idea, but not in economic terms. In economic terms, the consumer should make all these decisions.
Well said, Dr. Paul. And I'll finish by saying, if we Americans want our freedom back, we must first, and that's what the Ron Paul Liberty Report does every single day, break this mentality of empire, whether it be in trade or, militarily. And I'm going to read a quote back from 1952 from the heroic Garrett Garrett. And, keep in mind the time period where he's saying this, that, the Pentagon's going up, the CIA was made, and he was observing what was happening to his country. And he said, quote, "We have crossed the boundary that lies between republic and empire. The first requisite of empire is the executive power of government shall be dominant. Only a few years ago, if you had asked such a question, who speaks for the people, the answer would have been the Congress of the United States. Now it is the president standing at the head of the executive government who says, I speak for the people, or I have a mandate from the people. And a second mark by which you may unmistakably distinguish empire is domestic policy becomes subordinate to foreign policy. We are no longer able to choose between peace and war. We have embraced perpetual war." And that was back in 1952. And look at all these years later, we have to break this mentality of empire.
Boy, that's for sure, and it will be eventually broken. I think it's just that we should challenge it so that it can be done gracefully and peacefully and diplomatically, which is the difficult thing. But in our title, we ask who goofed. Well, it's Americans have a responsibility to the American politicians, and when I was in Congress, I certainly assumed that responsibility, less so than condemning what other governments are doing. And to blame somebody else, I think, is wrong. I really think our policies have been, what the problem is. The goofing has been done by our administration by stirring up most of these problems on trade. We mix it in. We have the sanctions, we have the tariffs, we have regime change that we're always involved in. So we blame others and we punish them. If they obey us, we give them a lot of money. If they don't, we bomb their countries and try to take them over. And then we punish them by freezing their assets where they can't even trade. This is not a good policy. I think we overkill. And I think there's a much better way, and I think we should look at the principles of free markets and personal liberties, and I believe the whole world would be better off for it. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.